Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, these are the Welcome to Geektown interviews. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. Before we wrap up our interview with writer and artist Darick Robertson, I need to take a moment and shout out my patrons as I do once per month. Those are Mike Sterling, Justin Bailey, Lily and Sam Breen, Jesse Clark, Ricky Garvin, Aaron Borst, Carla Hoffman, Julio Herrera, and Matthew Saint. As always, your continuing support is deeply appreciated. If you'd like to join this list and get access to uncut versions of my interviews, as well as additional audio and scripts from the previous version of the show, you can join at patreon.com/welcome to Geektown for just $1 per month. With that done, let's finish up my time with Darick. In this final piece, we start on Darick working with Garth Ennis, then a couple of other writers for a second stint at Marvel. Then work our way to Happy and The Boys, the latter of which you'll hear how Darick has been involved in the adaptation process. Finally, we look to Darick's future work, some of which actually involves going to his distant past. As my old cross-country coach would say, let's get to getting. Let's go ahead and move on to another long-term collaborator you've worked with. You met Garth Ennis and did some projects with him at Marvel. Can I ask how you felt working on something more grounded with those war comics that you did with like Nick Fury and the Punisher?
Yeah.
That project, it wasn't typical superhero work. It wasn't sci-fi. Other than like the ultra violence and one character aptly named Fuckface, it was a much more grounded kind of real world. Was that different, stretching those kinds of muscles?
Yeah. I mean, I honestly loved war comics also because I was a big Sergeant Rock fan back in my early years when I was collecting The Flash. That's when I started expanding out into other comics that were on the rack, and Sergeant Rock always kind of jumped out at me. I thought it was I love Joe Kubert's art, and Joe was a genius. So I used to draw. I even have my own little stapled together comic called The Forgotten Soldier. And my dad was a World War II second lieutenant in the Air Force and a veteran. So like the military had a lot of intrigue and respect for me. And my dad was a mechanic too. So like I love the nuts and bolts of how World War II stuff looks like. There's a very kind of dirty, greasy machinery about it all. And that element really spoke to me, like tanks and Tommy guns and that kind of stuff. So when it came time to do a war comic, I was all in. I had loved Michael Golden's work on the Nam, which I thought those issues were just phenomenal and very inspirational for when I started getting into designing Bourne. But I also loved what the concept that Ennis had come up with about this is a backstory for the Punisher. I thought was really intriguing. And at the time he was saying that, with the Punisher, was he driven crazy by his family getting killed, or was the crazy always there just looking for a reason? Yeah. And so that's what Bourne really explores, is that the crazy was always there. And I thought that was really great. And I also took it very personally because my father was a veteran and I lost a cousin that I didn't know in Vietnam. I remember my family mourning him when that was 74. So I was like 5 years old.
Right.
And, but I remember hearing about this cousin had died. I remember seeing Vietnam on TV and hearing about it in my very, very young childhood. So it was a real thing to real people. So we didn't have this distance from it. Like with World War II, you can go a little crazy and, Superman could fight Hitler or whatever, but because that was, some time back. But
right.
Vietnam felt fresh, and it still felt fresh even in late 90s, early 2000s when we did Born. So it was fresh enough, and especially with the Iraq war just starting up under dubious circumstances, I felt strongly that if I was going to do a war comic, I didn't want it to be exploitative. I wanted it to be grounded. And so I was fortunate enough that Nick Lowe was my assistant editor at the time. His father was a veteran, and he loaned me his photo album from Vietnam. So the backgrounds and the details that I drew into the comic were as authentic as I could make them. And that was my way of showing respect to the people that fought the war. I looked up all the realistic, grounded, accurate models and photos and bought action figures that were at the time Dragon and these kind of companies were making very detailed Vietnam action figures with all the little pieces. And there were these books by Osprey that would show you in detail the kind of weaponry they used and why this guy wore these boots, but that guy wore those boots. And so I tried to put all of that into place as best I could to make it feel grounded, to make it feel authentic. And I got compliments from veterans that said that I hit the mark, and that meant a lot to me. So that was, but being able to draw like the inside of a bunker, but I had, Nick Lowe's dad like sitting on a bunk, and the way the inside of these bunkers looked and what was on them and the way they had arranged them, all that was fairly accurate as best I could capture to tell the story.
Do you use a lot of reference normally in your?
Yes.
Okay.
I liked, especially if it's historical or something like that. If there's if it's going to be grounded in a reality, I like to make sure that it looks like reality. If it's fantastic, I prefer worlds where I can just make up whatever I want. But I don't get that world very often.
Yeah. Now, after that, you did some more work at Marvel. We talked a lot about Wolverine with Rucka already, and then you did the Nightcrawler series with Roberto Aguirre Sacasa. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Aguirre.
Okay.
Rhymes with McGuire. Roberto Aguirre Sacasa. He was terrific. I actually kind of wish he went off and started working in TV, but I wish we had done more comics together. We were another example. Like they took me off Wolverine and gave me Nightcrawler, but I was under the understanding it was going to be an ongoing book, and it went through a bunch of scheduling surprises. Yeah. And I ended up we ended up trying to cram 2 years of story into 1 year of stories. And what we could have done and what we were going to do, I wish it had been able to like be an ongoing book. I would have probably, that's my next favorite X-Man is Nightcrawler, and I would have probably run on that book for as long as they would have let me.
Well, other than the fact that guys named Kurt are just naturally awesome, what was it about him that appealed to you as first a fan and then as an artist?
I liked his fearlessness about how he looked. I loved that there was a panel in a Paul Smith issue that early on when I started reading the X-Men, and his girlfriend, who was a stewardess, comes in the door, and he's laying on the couch with a little Banff doll of himself and looking very suave. But he's got his blue skin and his yellow eyes, and his tail is perked. And he's just like, hey, I thought you'd like the real thing. And she's like, oh, I'm so happy to see you. And I'm like, that's so cool. Like, he's not ashamed of his looks. He's just himself. And he was, and out of all the X-Men, he kind of had a gentle soul. He was romantic, and he was funny. And like that he had this kind of swashbuckling element to him, but he looked like a demon. And I thought that was really cool. I liked that contrast a lot. So for me, it's like I related to him a lot too, because he had like curly hair like I did at the time. And there's a picture of me at like 16 totally dressed up as, or 14, 15 in that little frame. But I totally cosplayed a Nightcrawler for Halloween, because that's what they called cosplay then. Yeah. But I'm in a full Halloween costume of classic Nightcrawler with the blue face, and I made my girlfriend at the time made me these cool little yellow eyes that worked. I was able to put over my eyelids. But it came out to be a decent costume, but I was super into it. Like that's how, and that was, it's like I said, like Wolverine, all my sketchbooks are full of Nightcrawler and Wolverine, Nightcrawler and Wolverine. And then I would, mutant mass, like I just would draw stuff in my sketchbook, like Kurt reading a newspaper and crying into his hand because these mutants have been massacred, images like that could make covers, stuff like that
Mm-hmm.
with my very, very meager talent at the time. But I just love the character. And then Roberto's take on it was really smart. So he said, look, like the way Rucka had figured out, hey, Wolverine does stuff outside of the X-Men. Roberto's take was like, hey, this is their supernatural investigator. So it was like X-Men meets X-Files. And I thought
Right.
that was a really cool concept too.
And with his girlfriend being all into magic and his adopted mother doing the same, that it makes sense for
Exactly.
him to kind of go that direction as well.
Right. Exactly. And in our series, he goes to other realms. And we had a great second year plan where the X-Men were going to be overtaken by werewolves. And I was like, oh God, I want to draw
Oh man.
werewolf beast in the worst way, but
Yeah,
didn't
I can
happen.
picture that.
But
Well,
again, my career, got my clothes off, got in the pool. Here come the cops. Lights come on. It's all over. I'm out the door. So.
well, let's get into arguably your most successful book to date, especially when you consider adaptations and things like that. Let's get to The Boys.
Okay.
I understand you and Garth discussed the project years before it actually happened. Can you go a little into
Yeah.
that history and why it didn't happen the first time?
Mostly timing. When I was wrapping up Transmetropolitan, it was the first time we talked about doing The Boys, and we were both living in New York and hanging out a lot at the time. And so he said, hey, look, I have this idea. He was going to set it in the kind of in like the Hitman universe of the DCU,
Okay.
where he was able to do his own stories with Hitman, but Batman would come in or Superman would come in, but it was really about Tommy Monahan. And he thought he could do that with like a CIA team, this like a special black ops group that worked in the DCU to make sure that the DCU universe characters didn't get out of hand. But the ideas that he had were so outrageous that it became really obvious, especially after talking to a couple of editors that were interested in doing it, that we would just get kneecapped right out of the chute. So, I think it was my idea. I said, well, why don't we do what Alan Moore did with The Watchmen when they wouldn't let him use Blue Beetle and those characters, and make our own characters and set them in their own universe, and that's what we did. So we came upon coming up with these original characters. They were his names and ideas, but they were my designs. And the only one that and then with the boys themselves, it was my idea to make the female Japanese, just to kind of make it like less of four white guys and a black dude. I wanted to kind of diversify the group a little more. And Mother's Milk's power was an idea that I had early on, and I kind of said, hey, what if the mother is, because my wife was breastfeeding at the time, our daughter, and I was like, hey, whatever she eats goes into the baby, so what if the mom has compound V, does it go into the baby? And so that was my idea for Mother's Milk to get his power, and that's why he named him Mother's Milk, which was great. So he took that and ran with it, and that was the way. He's such a great writer that he'll take a good idea and make his own thing out of it. So unlike like working with Warren was different, where I had a lot more freedom to do my thing. Working with Ennis, it was a little different, wherein that he was very clear on what he wanted, but it was always very smart and very well planned out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've worked with a lot of different writers over the years. How many of them worked full script versus Marvel method? Do you have a preference on that?
Almost all the writers I've worked with worked full script. I think the only couple of people I worked with that did Marvel method over the years, Stan. I worked with Stan once, and he wrote Marvel method because he invented it.
There you go.
Yeah. So I did a story called Sweet Charity with Spider-Man years ago, and it was Ron Zimmerman. I was blanking on his name for a second there. Like I told you, the wrong name will get in the way of the right name. I was Ron, but anyway, yeah, Ron Zimmerman, terrific writer and funny guy, and he wrote very freeform. rather than full script. But most of the people I've worked with, especially like Warren and Garth Ennis, would write in full script.
Mm-hmm.
But they'd let me do what I wanted with it. They'd write full script. And I'm like, hey, I want to add this panel, or let's put this panel on the next page. And I'd explain it. And they'd say, yeah, that's fine, unless they had a reason to say no.
That's good.
So I bring my own thing to the storytelling.
Yeah, that's always important to feel like you're part of the collaboration.
Yeah, well, sometimes things read differently than they appear visually, and sometimes, and like I said, I'm a fan at heart. So if I'm going to turn that page, I want the next page to have, sometimes it's better to set it up and turn the page and reveal rather than reveal it at the bottom of a page and then change the scene. So just thinking like a comic book reader.
Right. Now, getting back to The Boys, the book started as a Wildstorm title, but quickly moved over to Dynamite. How long was that gap, and how involved were you in those discussions of what was
I was
going
very,
on?
very involved. We were a little blindsided because again, it was like the Wolverine thing. Like, I don't know how I do better than number one, but we were the best-selling book at Wildstorm and the biggest hit they had in years. And everybody at Wildstorm was over the moon with how well The Boys was doing. The people over at Warner Brothers and DC and higher were a little uncomfortable with the fact that our characters were appearing with ads for Justice League and Batman in between the filth and the fury that was The Boys. So it was sort of like, we were told we were going to be able to do a creator-owned book and do what we want, and we weren't doing it at DC. Wildstorm at the time was still considered its own company, but they'd just been absorbed into the DC fold to where, like, your original paper would say Vertigo, DC, and Wildstorm on it. And Jim was in charge of that, and Jim Lee was very happy with what we were doing and the sales. And so it was a little bit of a shock to all of us when we realized that the only choices we had were to move it from Wildstorm over to the Vertigo, or take it and do our own thing with it. So we decided it would be better to go and find a publisher that would let us do what we wanted to do, because at that point, if we kneecapped it or watered it down, it would have done like they did that with The Authority, and The Authority never kind of recovered as a major book. But when they started it, it was a real groundbreaker. And then it got tame. It just became just another superhero book. And we didn't want that to happen with ours. So Nick Verrucci and I go way back, and Nick, out of all the people, we got an offer from every single publisher in the business. But Nick was the one that called me up, and because he knew me, and he was like, you got to bring it to Dynamite because I read the book. I love it. I'll let you do whatever you want. And he made us the most compelling offer. So we ended up going with Dynamite. And it happened very quickly, which is why I ended up behind schedule.
I'd say it's hard to argue that The Boys is definitively anti-superhero in its themes.
I wouldn't. I think that it's. I think it's deeper than that.
Okay.
And this is why. Starlight's a superhero, and she's a good person.
Yeah.
You don't hear about them, but there are good characters in The Boys that are superheroes. Essentially, if you talk about the comics, Butcher's a superhero. Mother Smoke's a superhero. They have superpowers, and they do the right thing for the right reasons. But what the real theme of The Boys has always been is that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Ennis's take on the whole thing was, look, if he's a big James Ellroy fan, and so he was thinking, and he read a lot of stories about early Hollywood and how corrupt that was, and casting room couches, and there's a scene in Boys number 3 where Starlight meets Queen Maeve for the first time after being forced to degrade herself in order to join the team. She is trying to get her. She's just happy to meet her hero, and she tells her to fuck off. And that is like a story that Ennis had heard happened between Marilyn Monroe and Betty Davis when they were doing All About Eve. That she was like, Betty Davis could see that, look, you're just going to come and eat my lunch. So, you're the new thing in town. I'm on my way out. I don't really want to be your friend. And so that's sort of the way but he took that and put it in a superhero dynamic, which I thought was brilliant. And also the fact that, like, behind the scenes, these people are terrible, but the comic books, the movies, the action figures, all of that stuff is there to prop them up and make them appear to be the world's heroes. But again, character counts. And while you never really see Homelander run around as Clark Kent or whatever the version of him would be,
Right.
Superman will actually hide himself and try to be a regular dude so he can humble himself and not be the center of attention, not hog the glory. That was the whole point of the secret identity. So they're very different. And so to say we simply hate superheroes, I think what we really were trying to put a pin on was we hate corruption, and we hate, like, people that are liars and manipulators that have great power and use that to hurt people. The fact that these superhero battles would happen in the DCU or the Marvel U and nobody would really get hurt was just absurd. You're throwing cars around and buildings are collapsing. The whole smashes through a wall, or Superman crashes in through a ceiling. Those bricks are going to land on someone. That was just the idea, that, like, it was absurd that nobody ever got hurt. And the idea was like, well, what if they do? Who handles that? Like, how do you file that insurance claim? Who takes responsibility for those wounds? If your grandma gets smashed because, the Green Goblin, explodes a car and your grandma gets caught in it, who answers for that? And so that was the core idea where we started from, just that that somebody should be responsible. But if you're so powerful that nobody holds you responsible, how do you control that? The boys, they do it through information, they do it through manipulation, they do it through blackmail.
Both The Boys and Happy have been adapted into TV shows.
Yeah.
Before going into those adaptations, can you talk a little bit about how the comic came to be?
I've known Grant since he had hair, way back in the early 90s when I was working on Transmet, we hung out, and I got to know Grant a little bit back then, and we were always friendly. And so he had this idea for Happy in its infancy and had developed a lot of it, but I got offered the chance to do the book with him at Image, and I ended up creating and designing the main character. Happy was more my concept than his. He had originally thought of it to be like a My Little Pony kind of a character, and I have a drawing of Happy that looks like that, but we both agreed that it was missing something.
Okay.
And I thought, hey, this is a little girl's imaginary friend. Why limit ourselves to an existing look? And I thought, what would a little kid think of? And that's why he's like a donkey, unicorn, Pegasus. And because maybe she just the reason I came up with Space Beaver, I like the animals of a beaver. So maybe this girl had a thing for donkeys, but like the idea of a donkey being, Donkey from Shrek, but what if he was a unicorn and could fly, that kind of thinking. And I thought like a kid.
Yeah.
And that's where my design for Happy. And then I started drawing that Happy and making faces and doing things. I have like a little spreadsheet. I think I got published in the hardcover, but a little spreadsheet of different expressions, and it really came to life. And then it started to take on a Chuck Jones flavor of like just Looney Tunes off the top. And so that's really what the hook was. I think between that contrast between Nick Sachs, who was just this dirty, hardened piece of shit, and then that was Grant's concept, is that Happy was the idea that, a dancer who has a beautiful, just wants to bring joy to the world, but then does it on the internet and everybody shits on it, something good that gets crapped on until it dies. And Happy is like like that thing in the world. It's the spirit of that.
Yeah, I love that miniseries.
I was very proud of it. That's some of the best work I've ever drawn.
Now, it seems like you've been a little more involved with the show of The Boys, where you've been to the set a few times, and your art has been used.
Yes.
What's your involvement been like with that? Are you friends with the cast and crew? Or
Very much so. Yeah, it's actually been a very good experience. Eric Kripke is an absolute mensch, and he before he even wrote the first episode, he asked me and he had asked Ennis separately, like what we wanted the show to be. And I couldn't even believe I was having that conversation because it was so wonderful
Mhm.
in that, he would sit down and take the time to ask the creators like what he could do to make the show make us happy. And so I was real clear early on that I said, well, big thing is it's got to have humor. Otherwise, it's going to be a big dark slog. And I don't think anybody will want to watch that. So the sense of humor, he goes, yeah, I agree. It's got to be funny. And I go, I think that's really the secret sauce in The Boys is that it's funny. On top of that, I said that, I was really hoping that he'd include the scene where Huey's holding the arms after his girlfriend dies, and he was like, why? And I said, well, then I think that's your jumping on point, and I think the fans will go, oh, these guys have read the comic, they get it. And if you that, and that ended up in the first episode as I had hoped.
Yeah.
And then Dan Trachtenberg, the director, just did an incredible job of making it his own. Like he took a thing that in the comics was a bam, happens real fast and it's shocking, and then he slowed it down. And that was such an interesting choice because like just the little bits of blood hitting like Jack's face, and Jack just gives an incredible performance in that scene where he screams her name, like you really feel his pain.
Yeah, definitely.
And really fantastic, just right from and people talk about that scene like I never read the comic, but as soon as I saw that I was like, wow, I'm in. And I'm like, perfect. And that actress does such a great job of making you fall in love with her in like 2 minutes. She ended up on the new Frasier. But anyway, I've gotten to be friends with Jack and some of the other cast members. I see them at conventions and we hang out a little bit, and got to hang out with in San Diego. That was really nice. And went to a party together. But they're just good people. I've been to set, and I love being on set because I get to see how everything comes together. And I love film, and I always, a little part of me always wanted to make movies. So when I get to be on set and watch how it's all done, it's just they're long days, and I just can't tear. I'm more than happy to be there for the whole day.
Nice. Next season is the 5th and final season of the show.
Yes.
After the finale of last season, Eric was online and said that this was always planned as a 5-season story. Did you know that going in, or
no?
Were you kind of hoping that? Go ahead.
Yeah, because it's like I was saying about, my career. It's like, The Walking Dead has got multiple seasons. Of course, we've got the #1 show on Amazon, and it's ending. So, but at the same time, I did have a conversation some time back where he was clear. I didn't know it was 5 seasons per se, but he was very clear that he had regrets about another series that he had worked on that went on too long, and he wished that he had
we can guess the name of that show.
I don't want to talk shit, and I'm not gonna. I'm not throwing aspersions, and I'm not breaking confidences.
Of
but
course.
He said there was a show that went on without him that he wishes he had wrapped it up when he wanted to, the way he wanted to, and he wasn't going to let that happen with The Boys. And I thought, you know what, I respect that. And at first, when I got the news, I was like, oh crap, it's ending. And my son was much more mature about it than I was. He said, Dad, well, think about like The Good Place. Like how great that show is because it didn't keep going. And I went, you're absolutely right. And it was a good series that ran for, but it told a complete story.
Yes.
And he said, think about how much less that show would have been if they had just kept going with it. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. And I love that show, and I didn't want to see it end, but it is a perfect show. Like there is no bad episode, and it's an incredibly good ending. Everything, like we didn't lose cast members halfway through. It's like all those things that like very few shows have had the MASH magic where you could lose cast members and new people will be just as good. But been rewatching MASH. But it is. And but that's the thing with The Boys. It's like I'm trusting. I just let it go and said, look, we got Gen V. I think Gen V is terrific. It's been a really good spinoff. And then I found out shortly thereafter, they're going to do a whole new show. So the fact that we're going to get Jensen Ackles as the star of a whole new boys show that's set in the 50s, and Aya Cash, who I love,
Nice.
I couldn't think of a better follow-up to go and tell the past. And so I'm kind of excited to know that The Boys is going to go out on a strong finish, and then there'll be more. And I also noticed that like Jack Reacher is getting a movie, and I was like, maybe if this thing hasn't run out of steam, that might be, maybe we'll get something like that. I don't know. I'm not talking out of
Right.
turn.
Yeah.
I have no idea what the future for the thing is, other than they're filming season 5, and that is the final season. And Vought Rising has been announced. That will be happening. So those are the only things I know right now.
Well, let's get back into the comics for a little bit, and then we can wrap things up. I appreciate you taking all this time with me. Since you left Marvel after Wolverine and Nightcrawler, you've gone back to almost entirely independent books, mostly co-creations with writers and other artists like Ballistic, Oliver, Space Bastards.
Mhm.
Do you think you're done with mainstream superheroes entirely, or do you still have the itch to go back and do work for the big two?
Oh, not at all. I'm actually worked. I just did covers for the Absolute books. I did a Green Lantern story last spring. I'll take the work when I get it. I've just been I have been developing new stuff, and so I'm sort of like that's where I'm about to launch a new book with Tom Taylor. I'm kind of focused on doing more creator own work because that's important to me.
Mhm. So, are there any projects you can tease that are coming up?
I just did Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was fun. So
Right.
talking about
Yeah.
mainstream, you said, working for, it wasn't for the big two, but that was fun. No, I'm just kind of keeping myself busy. I think I can talk about this. Comes full circle, so it's a good place to kind of end the conversation. But I'm restoring Space Beaver digitally.
Okay, you hinted a little bit about that on Blue
Yeah, we're
Sky.
gonna do it. There's gonna be a Space Beaver omnibus. And I've decided to take it upon myself to recreate the original files because I can go in digitally and clean them up and fix them in a way I couldn't then because I couldn't afford the tools and I wasn't as experienced.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's like Zipatone is digital, so it's unlimited. Plus, I can clean stuff up and stuff that didn't print well at the time, which I had no way of knowing until I saw it in print. I can kind of punch up and,
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to preserve the work as best I can. So, the young me is represented, but it's still me. And it's just me 40 years later with all this experience and knowledge. And I think there's something kind of magical about that, where I can basically old me is now tutoring young me. And but also, I don't think a lot of people have really ever seen Space Beaver. And so it might be their first experience reading This omnibus might be their introduction to the character in that world. And so I'd kind of like to tighten up some things that I just didn't know what I was doing when I was making it up as a kid. And I also kind of figured like, if you really, really want to see Space Beaver just the way it was in 1987 when it came out, it's still out there. It's not like I'm going to go destroy every copy or, it's there to be found if you really want to see it. Have at it. But
Right.
it's warming quarter bins across the world. But this is a little different, where it's like this is a chance for me to fully realize something that means something to me and show it the way I wanted it to be shown and what I dreamed it would look like, as opposed to what it did look like. And a
Right.
lot of that crappy printing I was talking about, I made those files, those pages don't exist anymore. If they do, I don't have them. So I'm able to go in and kind of like rescue this artwork that was misrepresented at least. I mean, I was young and didn't know what I was doing, but I was also just a teenager. But now it's like, hey, I know what I'm doing. And so I've been showing some of my friends are old friends that knew the work from way back. And I showed them like the side by side, like,
Mm-hmm.
this is what I'm doing with it. This is the original file, and this is what it looks like now. And I've gotten nothing but huge enthusiastic praise for the process. So yeah, I'm kind of excited that the world's going to get to be they're going to kind of get introduced to Space Fever for the first time by seeing my very first work. And I'm doing little things like I'm going to tweak some dialogue and I'm going to fix some writing. And, I'm a better writer than I was at 17. And I actually had no idea what I was doing when I wrote those stories then. So, and we're relettering it, and it's just going to be a cooler looking package. And if you've never seen Space Beaver before, I can be proud of this to some degree. And if you have seen Space Beaver and you love him, you get to see it in a new way. But again, nobody's taking away your old issues. They're still out there. So this is just a labor of love.
Nice. Yeah, I have the trades that came out.
Right. And those exist. So you don't have to, it's not like, and those still have the original lettering in them and everything, but nobody knew what they were doing on that book. It was all like a trial by fire. And but now I do, and I want people to spend money on this. I want it to be something good.
You were learning, and it got your career started.
I learned by doing, and I like I said, it's one of the things you learn from getting chased out of the pool by the cops over and over in your career is don't take your clothes off at a stranger's house.
Well, again, I would like to thank you for all your time talking to me today.
It was great talking to you, Kurt. Thanks for the interview, and thanks for being discreet and respecting my boundaries. Appreciate that.
Of course, no problem.
As I just said, but want to reiterate, thank you so much to Darick for taking up nearly 3 hours talking to me about his time in comics, from the very beginning up to the current time and what's coming up in the future. These kind of career-arcing interviews are what I hope to be known for as I go forward, and it was great to get started with a personal favorite of mine. I'll be taking a break next week, then be returning with the first part of an interview with another writer/artist you may have heard of. Who is it? Well, you'll have to tune in then to find out, but I'll give you a hint. In our interview, we'll find out what happens when people stop being polite and start getting real. In the meantime, a reminder that you can hear an uncut version of this interview, minus a couple of cuts to remove dead air from bathroom breaks and technical issues, and a couple other questions that Darick preferred not to discuss, by joining Patreon for just $1 per month at www.patreon.com/welcome to Geektown. If you want a free way to help the show out, leaving a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts or other podcast site is always appreciated. But no matter what, as long as you continue to listen, we'll always say,
welcome to Geektown. Population, us.
Questions for the Welcome to Geektown interviews are written by me, Kurt Onstead. I also host, edit, and produce the podcast. Theme song was written by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Centeno.